This presentation is sponsored by the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission.
Hi, I'm Veronica Chambers, and I'm the author, along with several other New York Times journalists, of a book called Finish the Fight. I come to you from Hoboken, New Jersey, and I'm in my apartment, and I'd love to tell you about the book. Finish the Fight is a story of the brave and revolutionary women who fought for the right to vote. When I was growing up, I studied women's history, but I actually didn't learn a lot about suffrage. And then about a year ago, a group of us at the New York Times got together. We knew the centennial was coming up. The right for women to vote was won in 1920. We were coming on to 2020, and we really dove into the subject. And along with my co-writers, Jenny Schuessler, Amy Padnani, Vivian Wang, Sandra Garcia, and Jennifer Harlan, it was, first of all, it's super fun to write a book with other people because you get to spend a lot of time in a room hashing it out and thinking it through. And we really said, okay, what don't we know about suffrage? And one of the main things that we didn't know was how intersectional that movement is. So our book really focuses on the women in suffrage that you don't often hear about. We are often taught about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and sometimes we hear about Alice Paul, but we really wanted to talk about women like Mary Church Terrell and women that are thought of as race women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, but who were really integral to the suffrage story. We also really, really wanted to center the narrative of Native American women into this story, partly because, as one of the scholars that we interviewed said, you know, women have had the vote in the United States for 100 years, but Haudenosaunee women, which is a nation in the Native American tribe system, they have had political power for 1,000 years. So we wrote about women like Sitka Lasaw, who were so powerful. So, and we wrote about Asian women and Latinx women, queer women, straight women. And you just realize that even 200 years ago, when all of this started, it was mixed up, it was diverse, it was messy, but it was also a very powerful movement. So that's where we started. I think the theme of ingenuity that the book festival has taken on this year is really interesting, especially in a year when we're looking at the centennial of suffrage. You know, a lot of people think about the beginning of suffrage as being the convention at Seneca Falls, but really as early as the 1830s, women of all different backgrounds were giving speeches about political power and the importance of having a voice. And the thing is that if you date suffrage from 1830 to 1920, it took 3 generations of women to get the vote. There were women who fought for the vote, had children, they fought for the vote, and it wasn't until the 3rd generation that women got the vote. And they used every method we could think of. Suffragists were the first group to protest the White House. They formed the Silent Sentinels, and the idea was that they would be the first thing the president saw and the last thing he saw before he went to sleep. That was a profoundly radical idea. But they also used things like cookbooks and newspapers and cartooning to get their message out. So I think that idea of, if it's going to take decades, if the movement you're fighting for may not be achieved in your lifetime, the idea that you're constantly thinking, how do we keep this conversation on the table? How do we keep reminding people that we believe that this will not be an equal democracy until women can vote? So Finish the Fight, our book about women who fought for the right to vote. They say the age range is 8 to 14. We actually, all as grown women ourselves, kind of wrote it for ourselves. So I think it skews a little older, though if you're a strong reader, I think there's a lot to dive into it. The other thing I love about the book is that we went to 11 young women illustrators to create portraits and images for the book. They're all women of color and or queer illustrators. And so I think there's a lot of ways to kind of get in where you fit in. If you really want to dive into the stories, you can do that. We created a playing deck of suffragists that you might not have heard of. We did the Road to 36. It took 36 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. So Jennifer Harlan and I actually sat down and made a board game called Votes for Women that talked about that road to get 36 states to ratify it. So you can get into this book, you can read it, you can just look at the pictures, you can play a board game. And I just think that we wanted to give a lot of ways in, partly because we were on that journey of discovery ourselves, and we wanted to make it fun. You know, we are really passionate about history at the New York Times, but I think the whole thing is to make the history come alive. I think we love history because we know that it's not as boring as it's sometimes portrayed or kind of wrongly told to be. I think it's so hard to choose favorites among your favorite suffragists. There's so many like powerful, amazing, inspiring women. I think that one of the big surprises for me was Mabel Pingwon Lee. She was 16 years old. She grew up in Chinatown in New York at a time when the Chinese community was still really small. She rode on a horse in the front of a suffrage parade in 1913. It was one of the biggest parades that had ever taken place in New York or in the country. And the thing that's amazing to me about her suffrage activism is because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, when women could vote in 1920, neither she nor her mother or any of the other Chinese women who fought for the right to vote could vote. And she knew that when she was attending suffrage meetings, when she was being active. She just believed she had to support women. And she knew that there were barriers because of certain laws. Chinese women didn't get the vote till later, but she kept, being active and doing the right thing, knowing and hoping that the right thing would happen for her community eventually. And she also went on to become the first Chinese woman to get a PhD from Columbia University. So there's a lot to admire there with her story. I am a complete library nerd. That's not a big surprise. I know you're going to be seeing a lot of videos of authors, and we're all library nerds. Libraries have been really essential to my work as a journalist and just to my life as a reader. The Library of Congress has an amazing array of photographs, especially from the late 19th century, early and mid 20th century, that really fill in the gaps of some of the stories that you won't find in the written history. One of the things that we looked at for our book for suffrage and for our overall coverage of suffrage at the New York Times was really looking for the story of women of color and voting. And a lot of that history was repressed, actually. So when you find, I don't know if it's a Library of Congress photo, but it is a library photo. There's a beautiful photo of this group of 5 Black women who voted on that day in 1920, the first election of their lives. They were teachers in Virginia, and they were the first women in their county to vote. Like, that picture tells a story that might not have run in any newspaper. So I love that for that. I think also because my parents are from another country. We came from Panama via England. Being a new American, I think that the library and the librarians that were so kind to me as a child, they really not just put books in my hand, but they put the culture in my hand. And they really helped guide me in a way that my parents, as like super hardworking immigrants with multiple jobs, just couldn't walk me through all of the complexity of what I was entering as a young, new American. And so I think that it's so funny because my daughter, she does so much of her library borrowing online, but I'm very old fashioned and I love to be handed a book and I love to have a conversation with someone. And I value that experience so much. So I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is that being a journalist, being a writer is like an invitation to curiosity. 2 years ago, what I knew about suffrage would fit on maybe one piece of paper. And now, 2 years later, I've co-written this book with 5 other women. And I think the idea that, you can dive deep into something for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years is so exciting. I think that, we're at a moment where, because of where we are in the country and the world and a public health crisis, we're all spending a little bit more time alone. We're spending a little bit more time inside. But I think we also have a tremendous opportunity to connect with greater ideas that can help us shape the future. And I think that in many ways, as we were like sort of putting the finishing touches on Finish the Fight, we were thinking, oh my God, the suffragists, they were going through World War One. They were going through the Spanish flu. You find so many parallels in history. And what you realize is that, people survive and they find that ingenuity to go back to it. They find creative solutions. Sometimes having limited resources or choices helps you be more creative. That's something to remember as a young person. I think when I was a kid, I thought, if I was super rich and if I had all the help in the world, I could do anything. But I think actually not being super rich and only having limited help really forced me to dig into my own creativity and figure things out and try things and not be afraid to try. I didn't feel like I had a lot to lose. So I would advise young people and the people who teach them, their parents, the teachers, librarians, to really embrace this moment for connection and exploration and curiosity. Thank you so much for having us, me and my co-authors, as part of this festival.